podcast. I'm Scott. So good to have you join me today. Today we're kind of doing a kind of a film for thought, but it's not really a film. I'm actually going to be talking about some themes that I was struggling with, themes that really popped out to me when I was doing a playthrough of The Last of Us Part 2. Now, for those of you who don't know what The Last of Us Part 2 is, it is a PlayStation game for the PlayStation 4 that is produced by Naughty Dog. They're the same company that has done the Jackson Daxter series. Um, they've done Crash Bandicoot, I believe. I think that's correct. And then they also did Uncharted. Great. Anytime they put something out, they do put out great games. Sony's good at like having companies that make great games for their systems. And again, The Last of Us Part 2 is no exception. It's an absolutely wonderful game. From the gameplay to just the story to the emotions it's able to pull out of you, it's a wonderful game. Just to kind of talk a little bit about the game and kind of talk a little about some of the themes. Now, hopefully, you've paid attention to the disclaimer that I put on the beginning of this podcast, because here's where I'm going to start going, and I'm definitely going to be spoiling some key plot points in this game, some other things in the game. So if you're still playing the game and you haven't progressed very far, or if you are thinking about playing the game, do yourself a favor. Don't listen to this podcast or this episode. Please listen to me. Just don't listen to this episode. But make sure. But if you don't really care, then feel free to listen. So to kind of really get us into the story and kind of the themes, first I want to kind of briefly talk about Last of Us, the first game for the PlayStation 3, and then the remastered was on PS4. So in the first game, the world's kind of gone to heck. It's like a total wasteland. You have these people who are being infected, and they're kind of transforming into like these fungi type monsters. And they have names like bloaters, runners, clickers, etc. But throughout the game, even though you are experiencing these kind of infected monsters, one of the things that's kind of even more prevalent in the first game is that who is the true monsters? And a lot of times, the true monsters are people. Because even throughout the first game, you see that there is a you'll run into groups of people who want to try to harm you, that want to kill you, and mainly some of them are just because they're pure evil. Some of it they're doing it because it's survival, because supplies are scarce, and or they may think that you are infected, so they want to hurt you. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons on why there's violence, why there's hostility. Even in our world today, we see that as human beings, we can be unkind to other human beings based on a plethora of reasons. So throughout this journey, we see Joel, who's the main protagonist, and he befriends a young girl named Ellie. And the goal of the first game was for him to kind of travel all the way over to the other side of the United States to find a group called the Fireflies, because what we know about Ellie is Ellie had been bitten by an infected, but she is not turning, which basically means that there's something within her bloodline or something within her blood that prevents her from being turned into one of these monsters, which basically means that she may have the cure to kind of help change the world, to help fix everything, an antidote for the infected or people who do get bit, that they won't turn. So that's kind of like the premise. Let's get Ellie across the United States in this wasteland of America so that she can get better. And that's kind of where the game gets left off in the first game. However, when we get to the second game, you realize that Joel finds out, or actually towards the end of the first game, Joel finds out that in order for all of humanity to be saved, that they're going to have to kill Ellie. They're going to have to strip everything out, her blood, everything. They're going to have to strip it all out. And because of that, she's basically going to give up her entire life. Well, now, second game, we kind of see kind of the consequences of Joel's actions, which was to rescue Ellie and to make sure that she lives. So that's kind of where The Last of Us Part 2 picks up. And the main thing we see in here is because of Joel's decision to save Ellie, that there were a group of people who are called wolves who went and found Joel and tortured him, killed him right there in front of Ellie, in front of his brother Tommy, because of that choice, which again, Ellie had, at least from at this point in the game, Ellie has no clue about what had happened. Eventually, through backstories and flashbacks, you'll find out that she did know earlier. So that was the reason why they came and killed her. Or, I'm sorry, killed Joel. So then, when we think about, so I want to stop there, because really the big question that comes to my mind is, what is good? What is good? I hear people talk a lot about, well, I'm good, or I'm a good person. But when we look at the scriptures, when we look at the Bible, that teaches something different. The Bible, even when we think about, I think it's in Proverbs, where it says the human heart is wicked. Who can understand it? So when we think about the connection of heart, even when we think about that term heart in scriptures, we see a lot of times where the heart's corrupt, the heart's evil, the heart's hard. And even in Ezekiel, I will trade your heart of stone for a heart of flesh. So when we think about what is good, is there anything that is truly good in humanity? Are we capable of doing good things? Yeah. But are we good? And then if we are good, then why is it that we also make bad choices? Because, if we think about Joel and his situation and his ethical dilemma, he didn't want Ellie to die. Especially when we look at the first game, Joel lost his family to the infected. And not necessarily to an infected, he lost it actually to human beings being cruel because they thought they were infected. So he lost everyone. So Ellie became a daughter to him. So now, having someone who's kind of a daughter figure to you, and you find out that she's going to die, and you've had this journey, you build a relationship with her, that's a hard place to be in. If it was you, again, if it was you, and that's a point that got brought up, because when they're through flashbacks, when and Abby's father, who was a doctor, who was the one who was going to perform the surgery on Ellie, there was somebody, Marina, asked him, if this was Abby, if this was your daughter who had the cure, would you do the same thing? And it seemed like that he hesitated on even trying to answer that question, because he's kind of, in a way, glad he doesn't have to make that choice, to give up somebody and, kill them so that there can be a cure for the rest of humanity. And I think that's kind of a hard place to put in. It's a very ethical place to put in. But then, you think in a way, like Joel's making a good choice of saving, in some way, from Joel's mind, he's thinking, I'm making a good choice to save Abby, and if there's oppositions, I'm going to do it, which basically, he ends up killing Abby's father to rescue Ellie, which then that's kind of propelling Abby to go find Joel and to kill him, because you killed my father. And you caused this, and you continue to cause this whole mess of a world we live in because of your selfishness. So even though Joel thought he was making a good choice, it was really a selfish choice. And when we think about a selfish choice, usually those are bad choices. So then, the other aspect, when you're dealing with this idea of good and bad, a lot of times that's what usually leads to trauma. I mean, when we think about soldiers who are on the battlefield, they are doing good by helping protect, helping to be out there to help protect America or protect other citizens if they're serving overseas, making sure they're protecting citizens from um, dictator regimes. But then, of course, there's war. So here you are, you're doing good, but then you are experiencing the bad and the horrors of war. And sometimes you're doing things that, you're taking lives and you're struggling eternally on, should I have took that life? Well, yeah, because they were coming after me. But then when it's a child with a gun coming after you, when it's a woman with a explosives tied around her body, those are some difficult, hard moral choices that soldiers have to be quick in making those hard decisions. And of course, from that, they usually pay the price. They pay the price with their bodies. They pay the price with their souls. They pay the price with their mentality. And that's the thing we continue to see is because of the trauma. And not necessarily because, again, Ellie's going to go and find the people responsible for killing Joel. And she finally does get to the point where she confronts Abby. And not only that, but then you see a switch in the story where now you're controlling Abby and you're now looking at perspectives from Abby's perspective. You're going through her flashbacks now. And you're kind of seeing her side of the story, which is very interesting in a game. Because now here you're made to believe that this person's evil, that this person's bad, and that your goal is as playing the protagonist Ellie, I'm now going to go and kill the person who killed my loved one. And now you're playing the person who, for the first part of the game, you thought was evil. And now you're looking at her story and you're just like, oh my gosh. Like, she's not bad. I mean, she too suffered. Her dad's dead. She's struggling with relationships. She's, she was helping some scars and trying to help them. So really, and even her herself is saying, I'm not a good person. There's I can't think of the girl's name right now, but there's somebody said, oh no, I think I think you are good. You just don't know it yet. And it's just like, wow. And then finally you get to a point where Abby and Ellie have that confrontation and Abby ends up letting Ellie go. And now Ellie's having a life, has a family, but yet she is still suffering from the images and the trauma of Joel's death. And now she has to make a choice. It's kind of the same choice Joel has to make. Do I stay here with my family and have sleepless nights and continue to deal with this trauma? Or do I go and try to find Abby and take her life? At some point she does find out where she is. And then again, Ellie makes the choice to go and find Abby. And especially when we get to the end of the game, we see that when she gets back, after all the events that happen, which I won't spoil kind of that part, but when she gets back, basically she finds out she doesn't have anything to return to. Her son's gone. Her wife is gone. Her partner's gone. All because of selfishness. And that's kind of what we see, and it really struggles with this idea of good and bad. And when you're in that flux of good and bad and you're always trying to make these good moral, or at least you think you're trying to make good moral connections, it weighs heavily on our minds, it weighs heavily on our soul, and that's how we begin to get trauma. And even in this world, in this gameplay, especially when you find out that one of her friends or her partner, when you first find out that she's pregnant, should we even be raising a child up in this world where there's monsters, both infected and people who want to harm and hurt you because you're not like them? or they misunderstand you thinking you're the enemy and you're not. You're just a regular citizen. So when I think about those themes and I think about a game, like what is good? And I think, we always think about good and what it means to be good, for me as a counselor, for me as a minister, for me, the case is always clear that being good is loving your neighbor. And sometimes loving your neighbor is sometimes can be difficult, whether your neighbor's a jerk or whether, like in the case of Joel, loving your neighbor may be giving up something you love for the better of humanity. I mean, and I think that's hard, and I think that's very hard to do. I mean, I try to imagine, how did Abraham feel when he was first told to sacrifice Isaac? I don't think that was easy, but he was faithful, and because of his faithfulness, we see that God was able to spare Isaac and was able to provide a Passover lamb. And even in that thing, and just to kind of show the faithfulness of Abraham, is that when Isaac asked Abraham, "Well, Father, we have the wood, we have the fire, but where's the lamb?" And Abraham's response is, "Well, God will provide the lamb." Now, I don't think Abraham was lying. And here's why. Because if God had promised Abraham and Sarah that their descendants would be the one that would be as numerous as the stars. Well, Abraham and Sarah are of old age. We have seen that many times that they're beyond childbirthing years. They finally have a son. And at some point, in Abraham's mind, he goes, well, this is a promise that God has made. And if God makes a promise, he is always going to keep his promise, even though I don't understand all the complexities that are happening in the world today. And in some cases, maybe he thought, well, maybe there will be a lamb or a sheep that God would say, okay, here it is. Or maybe he would sacrifice his son, but at some point, Abraham might say, well, this is the one you promised me, so at some point, I have to get Isaac back. And at least what some people may say is that, that's kind of almost a first instance of resurrection in some ways. The idea that, that there is restoration in tragedy. And I think when we think about how do we have restoration in tragedies, and maybe to quote an Elevation Worship song, how do we transform our emptiness? How do we transform our graves into gardens? It's about living out the will of Jesus Christ. It's about being kingdom people that love God and love neighbor. And I think that's kind of the thing within this series of The Last of Us is, things are so deserted. And there was a great conversation between Ellie and I'm going to forget I can't remember her name, Ellie's partner. I can't think of it right now. Oh, that stinks. I should have wrote it down, but they're in a synagogue and her partner was talking about, her faith and her brother always being in the synagogue, and they were talking about religion. And I think that's very interesting, about all the stuff that's happening in their world and how does religion play in that. And I think a lot of times is where we see that play out is even if you may not see a supernatural existence of God in your current circumstances, you definitely will see God through the kindness of others loving one another. And I think, and I think that's kind of key. That's what we need to do as followers of Christ, as people, as kingdom people. We need to love God with our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. And when we are doing that, and we're doing that correctly, then that's when people can have hope. That's when we can start to differentiate what's good and what's bad. That's how we're able to heal trauma in the name of Jesus, when we are being kind to one another. And especially kind of dealing with trauma. I mean, we kind of see in The Last of Us with war and fighting and monsters and a lot of scary things and being in those situations, witnessing the death of loved ones. But when we think about other trauma that people deal with, sometimes people are dealing with trauma because of abuse. People are dealing with trauma because of um, broken homes. People build. Sometimes people are dealing with trauma and they don't know why, because some of the trauma that they may have experienced may have been when they were younger, where they don't really have good cognitive stability to remember the tragedy that had befallen them. So when we look at those, so that's why we see a lot of mental illness and disorders. A lot of that comes from trauma, at least at some point. And it doesn't have to be like a big, gigantic trauma like being in war and having PTSD, but it can just be, something very simple of your house catching on fire, and something that your grandmother who passed away that you had a great relationship with, like the one thing she gave you, which would be a rocking chair, burned in a fire, and that can cause trauma. Reading case studies, you see that sometimes little things like books or dolls, when they get taken away or when they get lost, and just the way how the parents handle that when a kid's upset that they have lost something that they have an attachment to, a connection to, that can lead to trauma. And it's mind blowing how much just evilness and selfishness, and even just being unaware of people's hurts, how that can cause trauma, whether you're months old or you're 100 years old. So again, those are some of my theological thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2. That's the gospel according to The Last of Us Part 2. So hopefully you've enjoyed this message. I know I usually do film for thoughts and kind of talk a little bit about that, but if you've been enjoying these conversations about kind of religious or psychological themes in video games, please let me know. I know, almost 13 years ago I did one on Castlevania Lord of Shadows. Long time ago. I still have the video, so maybe I'll throw that back up and kind of have you guys watch that. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Hope you like, share, and subscribe this podcast. Share it with a friend if you think that this is something that may be interesting. Again, I would love to hear from you. You can message me, whether in the comment section, both on my on a podcast page. You can message me on YouTube if you're watching this on YouTube, or you can kind of message me through my website, thescottstedman.com. All right, guys, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.